Hello and welcome to the 11th and final lecture in the module Reason and Persuasion. And this week I want to talk a bit about online campaigning, online persuasion. And I'm going to talk a bit about techniques that seem to have emerged, or at least came to prominence in the two big events in 2016, that is the Brexit vote and the election of Donald Trump. Now, I'm not interested today in this lecture in whether either of those were a good thing, right? So this isn't a complaint. We're interested in those campaigns because they succeeded, right? We want to know what works and why from a campaigning and persuasion point of view. One thing I should mention is that I'm not interested in exactly who did what or whether any particular actor in either of those campaigns did any particular action, partly because some of this is still subject to law, but also because really I'm interested in the next person. Right, I'm interested in the next campaign, the next election, where somebody might be looking at the things that are alleged to have happened in 2016 and think, well, even if they didn't use those techniques, maybe we will. The other thing that I want to point out early on is that we don't really know how effective these efforts were. It's clear there were deep cultural, socioeconomic and political reasons that drove both the success of the Brexit campaign and the election of Donald Trump. And those socioeconomic and political and cultural stresses and strains were there in British and US society really, without any internet campaigning, and maybe they were decisive. Maybe the stuff I'm going to talk about with Facebook and all that, maybe it didn't make any difference. Still, though, we can expect these techniques to be used in the future, and so we should start to understand them now. The first thing you need before we start talking about social media and campaigning and so on is you need a little bit more psychology. So I want to tell you about the 5-dimension personality model. This is one of the triumphs of personal psychology over the last few decades. And the idea of this is that personality types can be located in a space defined by 5 dimensions. And these 5 dimensions are openness to ideas and new thoughts, and particularly to abstract ideas. So openness, conscientiousness, which is pretty much what it means, that willingness to knuckle down and carry out tasks in detail. Extroversion, which is how outgoing you are, whether you're someone who gets energy and well-being from social engagement, from being with other people, or whether you're more introverted, you're the kind of person who finds company tiring. And that's distinct from the fourth dimension, which is agreeableness. And agreeableness is your interest in other people and your willingness to rub along with them. And it's important to note, I think, that agreeableness and extroversion are distinct dimensions. So somebody can be very extrovert but disagreeable, so they might really need to be the centre of attention but not really care very much about the people around them. Or they might be extrovert and agreeable, so they might very much want to be the centre of attention, but also be interested in the people around them, so that it's a two-way thing. Or you could be introverted and agreeable, right? So you could be somebody who does socialize, but ultimately finds it tiring rather than energizing, but nevertheless is interested in other people and finds it easy to rub along with them, and so on, right? So we've got openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And neuroticism is it's essentially kind of sensitivity to bad news. Okay, so you've got this 5-dimensional personality model. It was established as a hypothesis by kind of lexical analysis. And all that means is that you notice that the same words tend to get used to describe the same sorts of people, right? So somebody who's described as fun might also be described as outgoing or something. And so you hypothesize that two words that get used of the same people reliably probably refer to the same personality trait. And so you do a big analysis to see how many clumps, how many clusters words used to describe personality types form, and the answer is 5, and it's this 5. Now, that gives you a hypothesis, but then you have to test it, and that's what psychologists have been doing. They've been testing it. They've been doing intercultural studies because, of course, the original studies were all done in English, and if it's a lexical analysis, then showing that the personality types are robust across cultures and languages is particularly important. And people have tried to associate it, the outcomes with academic success. I mean, originally it was all about trying to understand and predict and enhance academic performance. And also there have been attempts to associate these 5 dimensions with political cultures. There's a test that's available to you on the module site. Here, by the way, are my results. And as always with these psychometric tests, the results don't tell you what your values are. They don't tell you how you're trying to live or what kind of person you're trying to become or how successful you are at that. And anyway, if you take a test once, that's just, one test. For real robustness, you would need to take many. However, one of the things that you will notice is that you don't need to answer very many questions to get a score. So there are just a few dozen questions on the psychometric test that you're going to do in a minute. If you disguise these questions as fun quizzes that you invite people to do on Facebook, for a lark, then you can gather an awful lot of data. You can gather enough data quite quickly to profile people on these 5 dimensions just by asking them to do a few Facebook. I mean, I did a few of those before we all knew how scary this was. I did one, how German are you? And it turns out I came out as 63% German, because it does bother me that my neighbours don't sort their recycling correctly. And apparently this gives me quite a high score for Germanness. But being British, I couldn't possibly say anything about it. Okay, so have a shot at the 5-dimension psychometric test. See how you come out. Compare notes. Notice how few questions they ask you before they give you a score. And then we'll come back and we'll talk a bit more about what was happening on the internet.